Gospel according to John, the first chapter. John begins his gospel with this prologue, a hymn to the Word through whom all things were created. This Word became flesh and brought grace and truth to the world. The reading begins at verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ.
In the biblical world, names matter. Names are used by biblical writers to reveal the identity, the essence, the innermost being of a person. That's why names change in the Bible after someone has a profound experience that leads to a fundamental change in that person. So, for example, Abram and Sarai become Abraham and Sarah. Jacob becomes Israel, Saul becomes Paul. The changes in one's name, they tell a story. So in the birth narratives, an angel tells Mary and Joseph to name their child Jesus, which means the Lord saves, or God is salvation. That says a lot. However, that's not the only name the son of Mary and Joseph gets. Taking a paraphrase from the Old Testament book of Isaiah, Matthew applies the name Emmanuel to Jesus, which means God is with us. And then there's John. Now, John takes the idea of God's eternal Word and puts flesh on it, as he describes Jesus as the Word made flesh. Literally, it's the idea of God embodying human form, and the word or name for that is incarnation. Jesus, Emmanuel, incarnation. The Lord saves, God is with us, the Word made flesh. So at this point, you're like, well, that's kind of interesting, but honestly, who cares? And that's a fair question, because sometimes stuff like this can be perceived as out of touch, intellectualized church nerd information that falls far short in helping us to live a full and complete life or deal with the real issues that we are facing. So what? Well, sometimes biblical stories have to be reinterpreted so that we can hear again what is actually being said. Maybe John's poetic language about the incarnate Word made flesh doesn't work well for you. Well, here's the same text that we read today, reinterpreted and told in a paraphrase form, written by Jim Stamper. I want you to listen to this. Initially, there was a pattern for everything. The pattern was God's. God was the pattern. The pattern was always God. Everything came from that pattern. There isn't anything else. The pattern is both the source of life and the meaning of life. It's a way of being alive in opposition to death, and death cannot overcome it. God sent a man named John to tell people about the possibilities of this way of being alive in opposition to death, so everybody would trust the source of life. John wasn't the source of life. He taught how to recognize the pattern. The true pattern, the source and meaning of everybody's life was coming to people. To some people, however, life, and what life is all about, is unrecognizable. Some who could be expected to see the possibilities of this way of being alive select death instead. Others embrace life. They trust what life offers. Life offers something more intense than the strongest family ties, obtaining a new parent, God, the source, the meaning of life itself. The initial pattern for everything, that is, became human and lived among us. We experienced how awesome that is, as awesome as a newborn baby is to its dad. The gift of life and all of its possibilities. So, God as a life-giving pattern in this world that stands in opposition to death. Have you ever been in a situation where you did not feel that you were religious enough? Do you know what I mean when I say that? So, I've been around people who have talked about their unshakable faith and how they have such a close personal relationship with God and how God answers their prayers. And so when they pull into a Target and a parking space opens up right in front of the door, that was the power of God at work blessing their life. After listening to something like this, have you ever shook your head and said, well, that's just not my experience? Or if you've never met anyone like that, do you ever feel that your faith or spiritual life is insufficient or even non-existent? And you want to do something to address that, but you have no idea what to do. So personally, I find it really hard to connect to the idea of an infinite abstract God who exists somewhere out there and then comes into people's lives randomly to give parking spaces to one and winning lottery numbers to another, healing someone else while completely ignoring a whole group of suffering people. That's not a God I can relate to or know or even want to know. If God is outside of this world, outside of where I find myself living each day, well, then what? How do you have a relationship with that or love this kind of God or even know someone who lives outside of all that we know and experience? I mean, I've struggled with this over the years, and yet the spiritual side of me won't let me stop searching. And this is where the gospel we read comes into play and meets us right where we are. So, for John, Jesus is the Word made flesh, the incarnate God who reveals and brings out the light. Or for Jim Stamper, who reinterprets John's gospel, God is the pattern in the universe that has always existed, that has always been there, and Jesus embodies this so people can experience it, can see the pattern. Other religious leaders have used similar metaphors, comparing God to a song or a melody that has always been playing, and Jesus shows us how to live in tune with that song or melody. This is what the gospel for today is really all about. For John, Jesus does not come to start another religion. He comes to show us the light, the pattern, the song that gives life, that moves us and brings peace and wholeness to life. For John, Jesus is the light, is the pattern, is the song, is God that takes on flesh and blood to be in creation, not outside of it. And so in Jesus' generosity and compassion, that shows us what God is like. And in Jesus' self-sacrificial love and forgiveness, That shows us what God is like. That's who God is. That is how light comes into the world. That is how the pattern looks. That's how the song goes. And so when we see in our everyday lives generosity being played out, or someone sacrificing something of themselves for the sake of someone else out of love, I think about parents who do this. Or when we see those people or groups working for the well-being of others by giving of their time, attention, finances, or when we see or hear stories of forgiveness and reconciliation and people working for justice, we're moved, we're inspired, we have hope, because that is the way of Jesus, and Jesus is the way of God, according to John. An infinite, massive, invisible God that exists outside of our reality is really hard to get behind and wrap our minds around. But justice, love, grace, mercy, compassion, the way of Jesus, I can see that. I can understand that. I can experience that. I can relate to that. I can feel the warmness of that light. I can see the pattern. I can play with that song. And in this way, I can be in relationship with God. I can find life and hope and purpose. As we begin this new year, may you come to see that God is not somewhere out there, but is in fact all around. May you come to see through Jesus the incarnation, the light, the pattern, and hear the song that is God, that you might find peace and wholeness within yourself and give it to others. Amen.